For example, I had a debate a few years ago at Franklin and Marshall College with the humanist philosopher Paul Kurtz on the topic, goodness without God is good enough. And I argued that if God does not exist, then there are no objective moral values, moral duties, or moral accountability. And Kurtz, to my astonishment, completely misunderstood the argument. Here's how he replied. This is quoting from his rebuttal. He says, if God is essential, how is it possible for the millions and millions of people who don't believe in God to nonetheless behave morally and ethically? On your view, they could not. And so God just is not essential. Many people, indeed millions of people, have been optimistic about life, have lived a full life, and find life exciting and significant. Yet they don't wring their hands about whether or not there is an afterlife. It's living here and now that counts. Now, all Professor Kurt at best showed was that belief in God is not necessary to living a good and happy and optimistic and exciting life. But of course, that wasn't my argument. It does nothing to refute the claim that if there is no God, then moral values and duties are just human illusions. So, to repeat, the argument is not that belief in God is necessary for objective morality. The argument is that God himself is necessary for objective morality. Now, is there any question or discussion about that defense of premise one? Yes?
How then are secular people able to formulate ethics?
Well, as we'll see later on, they simply take as their starting point the intrinsic value of human beings. They just take that as a given, that human beings have intrinsic moral value, and therefore you develop an ethical system based upon what would promote that human flourishing. But they have almost nothing to say to justify the starting point. The starting point is just sort of hanging in midair with no explanation. Okay, now the other response that you will get to this premise, if you assert it, is the so-called Euthyphro dilemma. You can almost be guaranteed to get this. The Euthyphro dilemma. This comes from a dialogue by the ancient Greek philosopher Plato called Euthyphro, in which a character named Euthyphro confronts Socrates, and they talk about moral values. And here's the dilemma. Is something good because God wills it? Or does God will it because it's good? Is something good because God wills it? Or does God will it because it's good? And the dilemma is that if you say, well, something is good just because God wills it, then moral values and duties become arbitrary. God could have willed that hatred and rapacity and cruelty would be good. And therefore our moral duties would have been to hate one another and cheat and harm one another, which seems incredible. Moral values seem to be necessary. And so it seems impossible to think that that could have been our moral duty. On the other hand, if you say, well, no, God wills something because it is good, well then, what is good or bad is independent of God, and God himself has to look to whatever is good, and then he will make his commandments based on that. So that would undercut the first premise, that if God doesn't exist, objective moral values and duties don't exist. So that's the basic dilemma. Is something good because God wills it, then moral values become arbitrary. If God wills something because it is good, then moral values are independent of God. How do you escape the horns of this dilemma? Well, fortunately, we don't need to refute either of those two horns because it's a false dilemma. That is to say, those aren't the only two options. There's a third option, and it is this. Namely, God wills something because he is good. God wills something because he is good. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that God's own moral nature, his character, is the standard of good and bad. And his commandments to us are necessary expressions of his own character or nature. So in short, our moral duties are determined by the commandments of a holy and loving God. Our duties are determined by the commandments of an essentially holy and loving God. So, moral values are not independent of God because God's own moral nature defines what is morally good. God is by nature compassionate, fair, just, truthful, and impartial, and so on and so forth. So, his nature is the standard which defines what is good or bad. And his commandments then necessarily reflect his own moral nature. And therefore his commandments are not arbitrary. They are necessary expressions of his nature. So when the atheist says to you, well, if God had commanded that child abuse be good, would we be obligated to abuse our children? Don't fall for that pseudo question. That's like asking, if there were a square circle, would its area be the square of one of its sides? Well, there's no answer to such a question because the condition is logically impossible. There cannot be any such thing as a square circle. So whether the area of the square circle is pi r squared or the square of one of its sides is a meaningless question. Similarly, to say, what if God had commanded something contrary to his own nature is as absurd as saying, what if there were a round square? Therefore, the Euthyphro dilemma simply presents us with a false choice, and we shouldn't be tricked by it. The morally good or bad is determined by God's nature. The morally right or wrong is determined by his commandments. Something is right because God wills it, and he wills it because he is good. This view has been defended in our day by eminent philosophers like Robert Adams of Oxford University, William Alston at Syracuse University, Philip Quinn at the University of Notre Dame. And yet, philosophers, non-Christian philosophers, continue to present this Euthyphro dilemma as though it had not been answered over and over again. For example, in the very recent book, The Cambridge Companion to Atheism, published in 2007, just this year, they have an article on the moral argument for God by a very eminent secular ethicist. And the only version of theistic ethics, of God-based ethics that he knows about, is the view that God just arbitrarily made up moral values. A straw man which he has no trouble refuting. But he doesn't cite Adams or Alston or Quinn or any of their work, nor does he even discuss the alternative that I've laid out here this morning. He just attacks the straw man that God arbitrarily made up the moral values that there are. So any question then about that alternative or way out of the Euthyphro dilemma? Yes?
Is it possible that God's nature could have been something different that would have given rise to a different standard of morality?
No, I don't think so. The very idea of a nature is that these are essential properties. When we speak of something's nature, we mean that it could not be the thing that it is if it lacked those properties. So, for example, it's part of the nature of a square to have four corners. Any geometrical figure that didn't have four corners would not be a square. It is essential to a square to have four corners. So similarly, God is essentially loving, compassionate, just, fair, and so forth. If he lacked any of those attributes, that being wouldn't be God. But God, as a necessary being, cannot fail to exist. So God must have those attributes.
So he has no choice but to be good.
Right. Right. Now, I think that's a loaded way of putting it, because what we're saying is that he's too good to be bad. I mean, it's not as though he's constrained by his own nature. It's just that God is such a great guy. You know, he's loving and kind and fair, and so that's the way he is. And he won't act he won't act contrary to his own nature. He can't. Yes, Walter, good to see you.
Good to see you too. Wouldn't the secular say that, all right, even if I grant the nature of God is objective, that the recognition of that God is subjective from religion to religion, and that therefore, unless you believe in some sort of divine dictation theory that God is saying this is what's objective, that man's reception of it is subjective, and therefore how can you know which is the true God?
This argument, as I presented it, just doesn't speak to the question at all of how we know what the objective moral values are. And here I can simply agree with my secular counterpart who believes in objective moral values. Any moral intuitions he wants to appeal to, or any other sort of theory of religious, not religious, but ethical knowledge that he wants to appeal to, I can appeal to too. So the argument doesn't have anything to do with how we come to know these goods. I mean, it would be consistent with the argument that we don't have any idea of what these goods are. You know, we don't know at all. We're all in a muddle or something. That is a wholly different question that the argument doesn't address. Well, what's the atheist supposed to do at this point? Most atheists actually want to affirm the objectivity of moral values and duties. They don't want to be relativists. They want to affirm there are objective moral values and duties. So what can they do? Well, at this point, most of them, as I said, simply embrace a kind of stubborn humanism and just stop there. They just say whatever contributes to human flourishing is good, what negates human flourishing is bad, and that's the end of the story, no more questions asked. Well, I think the problem with this is that if you take human flourishing as your ultimate stopping point, so to speak, then that is a premature stopping point. We all have to come to some ultimate explanation, some ultimate stopping point. But taking it at human flourishing, I think, is premature for two reasons. First, it's arbitrary, and secondly, it's implausible. Why do I say it's arbitrary? Well, I think it's arbitrary because given atheism, why think that human flourishing is special or distinguished? Why is human flourishing more morally valuable than the flourishing of ants or mice? Why think that inflicting harm on another member of the human species is wrong? When I put this question to the Dartmouth ethicist Walter Sinnott Armstrong in our debate, his reply was, it simply is. Objectively, don't you agree? Well, of course I agree that it is wrong to harm another human being, but that's not the question. The question is, would it be wrong if God does not exist to harm another human being? And given an atheistic worldview, I just can't see any reason to think that human flourishing is morally objective or has any special worth. Secondly, I think it's also implausible as well. Atheists will sometimes say that moral properties like goodness and badness just attach necessarily to natural states of affairs. The word here that is often used is the word supervene. It's a technical term, supervene, and you can understand this by looking at its root. Super means above or on top of, like superimposed, that's to put something over something. Super is above. Vene or venire comes from the Latin meaning to come, as when we talk about Advent season, same root there, something that is coming. So supervene means that something comes on top of something, or it comes over it. And the idea here is that moral values like goodness and badness supervene on natural states of affairs necessarily. They necessarily attach themselves to natural states of affairs. So, for example, the property of goodness supervenes on a mother's nursing her infant. And moral badness would supervene on a man's leaving a store with merchandise and failing to pay the clerk for the price of the merchandise. And so the atheist would say that these moral properties just sort of naturally or necessarily attach themselves to these natural states of affairs. Well, now, I have to say that on atheism, that strikes me as extraordinarily implausible. On atheism or naturalism, why think that these